welcome everyone to Demos. My name is Polly Curtis and I'm the CEO at Demos. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this event in which we're attempting to answer a big and very important question. How can we use data to drive social mobility? Welcome also to our online audience and our speakers, who I'm going to introduce very shortly. But I thought I'd just kind of set the scene a bit for us to kind of tackle this question together. Successive governments have put social mobility front and centre, and Labour has now made a version of this one of its 5 missions for government, should it win the next election. Their mission to break down the barriers to opportunities at every stage for every child puts this at the heart of their electoral promise. But successive governments have said similar, and low social mobility is an enduring challenge for the UK, with people's future occupations and earnings too often affected by their background and where they grew up. This has serious implications, not only for individuals, but for companies, for employers, and for the economy at large, with weak job matching and low productivity continuing to hamper growth. So this mission to improve social mobility also matters to the mission to drive economic growth as well, and the health of the nation with that. It's really far-reaching. So Demos recognises this as a serious challenge, and we're currently working with the Co-op to make a strong business case for the promotion of social mobility. And we're delighted to be hosting this event with the Social Mobility Commission to focus on this key driver of social mobility, how to use data. So to understand and address current social mobility challenges, we need strong evidence and data. However, the Social Mobility Commission's recent People and Places report raises concerns that issues like gaps in data, weak data, a lack of data harmonisation between devolved nations, for example, are leading to a misdiagnosis of problems and a lack of targeted action. So this is really concerning and important to get right. So it matters at a national level, but it also matters to employers and how employers can drive change in their teams as well at an employee level. Huge goodwill around this issue, as the fact that so many of you have turned out in this horrible rain is testimony to, and all our online audience as well. And across the country, there are countless of examples of organisations and individuals championing social mobility. Co-op, the Social Mobility Commission and others have worked to create an employer toolkit that helps organisations understand and improve their socio-economic diversity. With that in mind, Demos is delighted to host this panel discussion in partnership with the Social Mobility Commission. And we've assembled a brilliant expert panel who, through their work, make use of the available social mobility data in a whole range of ways they're going to share with the room today. They'll be able to speak to the particular data challenges they face and help us understand what needs to change for data to truly drive social mobility. So I'm going to introduce our panel. We're going to hear some opening thoughts from them and have a wider discussion about data, but I'm really keen to bring the audience in for contributions and questions. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A as well, so do be thinking of your questions, and we'll be taking questions from the online audience as well via the Q&A function, which you'll see on the screen. Right, so I'm going to introduce our brilliant panel. I'd like to welcome Resham Kotecha, is Deputy Chair of the Social Mobility Commission and Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute, so very well placed to talk about this. ODI is a not-for-profit that works with companies and governments to build a world where data works for everyone. And to Resham's left, we've got Hodge, who is Associate Director of School System and Performance at the Education Policy Institute, which works to promote high-quality education outcomes for all children and young people, regardless of social background. And the Education Policy Institute is particularly well known for its annual reporting on the disadvantaged gap. And then Paul Gerrard is Public Affairs and Board Secretariat Director of the Co-op, where he leads engagement on public policy, including on slavery, loneliness, stop worker violence, climate justice, and as we're discussing today, social mobility. And Paul also sits on the Social Mobility Commission's Employers Advisory Panel and was previously a solicitor for 20 years. So, welcome everyone. We're going to start with just opening remarks from each of our speakers. We've asked the question, why does data matter when it comes to understanding social mobility? How do you describe the current state of social mobility data, and how does it affect your area of work? So, kicking off with Resham.
Thanks very much, Polly. What an esteemed panel to sit on, so thank you for having me. And as you heard in the generous introduction, it brings together my two passions, data and social mobility. And when we talk about data at the ODI, what we often say is what gets measured gets done. And I think of the kind of core TLDR, if you were to stop listening to me right now, that would be a really important sentiment to take away, that if we don't have valuable and reliable ways of measuring the different circumstances of people's lives and the outcomes that they are likely to achieve, we can't actually create good policy. And right now we have significant data gaps, and I'm sure my co-panelists will also be touching on this, but if we have significant data gaps or interoperable data where data sets can't be matched against each other, if we have significant time lags in the data, if we don't have granular enough data, then what we end up with through these gaps is the inability to actually analyse the situation of what's happening when it comes to social mobility. And the problem with that is we can't actually create good policy. So we either create policy that works for some people, not all, or we only take the headline figures and we lose the actual impact on different cohorts of groups. And so we often end up with overspending of money on policies that aren't really impacting the people that need it most. And we're also in a political context where headlines matter, headlines are rewarded, and it often means we lose out the people who are really struggling or who are the hardest to reach because they aren't measured or they aren't captured in that. So what we're pushing for, both in the social mobility and the ODI, is open data. And what we mean by that is really thinking about what data do we need to collect to be able to understand the circumstances of people's lives. And I should say the social mobility, when we look at it at the FMC, it depends on who your parents are, what your parents do or have done. It depends on your education level, the skills you receive, but also, and this is really important, on where you grew up. And we're used to hearing about a north-south divide. But actually the data we need to collect or should be collecting goes beyond just where you grow up, because we've seen, for example, that in the city, we're in London, and if you live in London or grow up in London, you have some of the best chances of getting higher education or a professional job, but you also have some of the highest chances of being unemployed or economically inactive or living in poverty. So it's not enough for us to take big data sets and take messages from that. We would miss out huge numbers of people in doing so. And at the end of 2022, I do have some of the brilliant members of the Social Mobility Commission here, so I won't name them, but hopefully you'll get to speak to them in the networking afterwards. But they released a report, we released a report called Data for Social Mobility. And in that, we identified some of the current barriers to finding and using socio-economic data. And that report also covers ideas on how we could improve it, because it is really valuable that we can break down these barriers and actually create, collate and share these valuable data sets. So as part of that, there were 3 core recommendations. There's lots in there, but I'll keep it high level. One is about better data collection. So the recognition that we need regular and effective data collection on occupations. We don't really have that, and we also need longitudinal birth cohort studies. And there have actually only been 4 of those since World War II. And what that means is when we have that type of study, we can track a person from birth to death, and we can see the actual impact of their entire life circumstances on them, from what their parents did, to what they do, to the education they receive, where they live, how that impacts their life chances, their education, and what that means for them. And we can therefore take action to make sure we improve their life chances and the life chances of those coming after them. We also recognise that one of the key issues is data linking. So I touched very briefly on interoperable data sets, but right now we often have data sets that are siloed. So you might be able to look at someone's income, you might be able to look at someone's education, you might be able to look at someone's occupation, but we don't really have the ability to overlay those together in a way that means we can get a truly meaningful understanding of someone's social mobility and their ability to achieve their potential. And we want to be able to see the impact of these different circumstances so that we can create cohesive and effective policy that covers a range of issues. And the third recommendation is better data sharing capabilities and processes, so that where data does exist, this can be opened up and used in a better way. Central government holds lots of data sets that they don't share within departments. There's no central directory. Central government doesn't share with local government in the way it could, in our view, and vice versa. And we actually think this data needs to be opened up to civil society, to researchers, to community groups, to universities, to schools, to employers of all kinds, big and small, like the work you do on the board, which is great. So we think tackling and identifying these gaps and then taking the actions to make them more interoperable and work together would really help. There's also things we think could work around linking data sets. So for example, in other jurisdictions like the US, there are links between parent and child tax records, which means researchers and civil society and organisations like the Social Mobility Commission can analyse the impact and changing effect of life chances between generations, seeing what your parents had in life and what you have in life. And we don't actually have that, which means it's getting difficult to create a truly clear picture of what your parents' life circumstances do and have an impact on yours. The Department for Education has actually started to construct household data for children in school. So we mostly rely on the measure of free school meals, which has a very low threshold. So yes, you capture some of the least well-off children, but you don't capture an entire cohort of children that sit just above that very low threshold. And so the DfE has started to create and construct household data for children, linking kids to parental income. And we think that's a great step forward, but that data is not available outside the DfE, which means that we've created, or well, not we as a country, but the department is creating a valuable data set that, if opened up to researchers and other organisations, would mean we could do a huge amount with that and start to overlay other data sets. But we're not yet in that position. So better data sharing, and then finally, and I know I'm leaving time for questions, but continual evaluation and monitoring. And this is where I think we could really focus on doing a better job, because various governments enact policies, but they need to make sure that the evaluation and monitoring comes with it. And it is difficult to tackle social mobility from an evaluation point of view. It is difficult to check how programs are working, because by virtue of the issue, these things can take years, if not decades, to really truly see the impact of. But the more we can be evaluating programs, the more we can iterate, reiterate, and adapt the programs to adapt for changing life circumstances. We think there really is a role for everyone. So whether you're in government, policymaker, Whitehall, think tanks, schools, universities, employers, communities, just an individual, actually, we each have a role to play in considering how we can improve social mobility for those around us, and think about how we can use our day-to-day work to improve opportunities for others. And I'm sure we'll get to it in questions, but I hope someone will ask me about our state of the nation work. That's great.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
More than what you were saying there for a second, to frame the rest of the conversation. The way I've been thinking about this is population level data that helps you understand kind of policy impacts and measure and evaluate. And then there's employer level data, which helps employers do the same, but they're quite different data sets. Thinking about the kind of the infrastructure of the data we're talking about today, I think those are the two main categories, or are there any others that we should be considering?
It can be valuable, but the more data is shared, the more it's overlapped, the more valuable it becomes. So employers having their own data is valuable for them in terms of tackling their social mobility issues. But if that's not shared, it becomes much harder for that to become a cohesive industry, sector, or employment-wide level of work. We also have challenges, some of the data. So we rely a lot, for example, on labor survey data, but the challenge we have in a data set like that is there's no response rate, there's time lags involved. So data can be helpful when it's collected, and it's really the question is to what end and for whom. So of course it's fantastic if employers are tackling social mobility, but the challenge then is, well, they can work with people as they get to the workplace, but what about the 18 or 21 years before that, where actually a lot of people have their life chances shaped for them. We know from our work that the least advantaged children start school 4.5 months behind their most advantaged peers. by the time they leave school at 18, that gap has increased to 18 months. So it's really important for employers to be thinking about their social mobility actions. But equally, if we've got less advantaged young people a year and a half behind their peers when it comes to education, we've made it that much harder for them to actually achieve in the workplace because they're starting, that's much behind. So it's important, but we need to think about what other data can we feed into those two key data.
And how it all joins up.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Louis.
Yes, sure. Thanks for me. So yeah, as Polly mentioned, I work with the Education Policy Institute, and so naturally we get very focused on education. But I don't think education is necessarily the golden bullet, should we say. So we know there's lots of, as you just alluded to, lots of gaps between the most disadvantaged pupils and more advantaged peers. But we also know that those gaps already exist before children even start entering into the school system. So disadvantaged people are already 40% of the gap that they leave school with is already present right at the beginning when they're only kind of like 4 or 5 years old. So yes, education is great and it can be a great leveler, but it's also not the only thing that happens. When it comes to the kind of the data, I think measuring things is of course helpful, and I think when things are there, and then things will naturally kind of get done. But I think the key thing is not just measuring these things, but actually starting to understand the mechanisms and the drivers that come from this and that. So that does come back to my kind of opening point about this gap. So this gap is already there, so young. I think we should also be looking kind of broader. What's happening? We talked about income. I think wealth is now potentially something that we should start be thinking a lot more about. We've seen huge kind of booms of the housing market for a period of time, and lots of evidence now is starting to show that these things really start to play out in terms of how that intergenerational mobility happens. I think it's also quite important to remember that social mobility is something that's really important, but something that happens over quite a long period of time. The period of time when you measure someone kind of like outcomes, what they're doing in their occupation, their incomes, all these things that we might care about. It was naturally a long time ago since their parents were doing the same thing. And so there's always going to be a bit of a challenge for us on a data front to really understand what's going on, but that doesn't mean we should give up. I think there's something about the intermediate outcomes, the education stuff, and we are starting to really understand data that's already started to kind of be made more widely available now. So there's now a data set that links, which is the longitudinal educational outcomes data set, which is linking educational outcomes and following people into the labour market, and we're starting to understand a lot more about how those pathways look into the future. The missing thing there, back to what you were saying earlier, is we don't really know what's happening with the parents so much. So we have this measure of free school meals, but free school meals currently is 37.5% of people's population. So that's a really kind of binary yes or no measure, and it can be quite hard to then really drill down and really start to understand what's going on. That might be those just above that threshold, but even within that group, those right at the bottom of that group. The key thing we also don't understand probably enough about is the other end of the distribution. So lots of the data we have, so administrative data, looks at what we call that we have the National Pupils Database, which is a kind of a record of all pupils in England. But they're the pupils that are in the state education system. So also at the top, we have this group of pupils that we don't really know very much about. We know they're probably quite well off, but they're not always. But those entering into the private system, what's happening to them? We are kind of less sure. There's a bit of a gap there. And of course, mobility requires bringing those up from the bottom, but kind of necessity. We should be understanding what's happening at the top as well. I think
that was fascinating, like following Resham's kind of case for joining up data. I think what you've really just told us is how patchy it is and how broken up the data is in different pockets, the missing gaps. So like that was a real portrait of some of the challenge. Cool.
Why is data important? The corpse 6,000 colleagues, 5.4 million. We don't have data. We don't have coming in. We don't know how they're progressing. And I think on any scale, if you're an organisation of any scale, if you don't have data, just for those, it's just anecdotal, and that's not really helpful. I think what we have found over the last year, so we've gone from not collecting data 3 years ago to about 70% of colleagues have now provided us with the SEB data. Other characteristics, 85%. So it's still a gap, but we've made rapid progress. But we've combined that with qualitative data. So last summer, making the league did research runs on the experience of people from Polish and more socio-economic background in the poll. When you start to bring together the qualitative and the quantitative data, that's when you really start to understand it. And it's at that point that you can take action. And for me, the data is important, and certainly the former civil service 20 years, I understand the big policymaking absolutely. For a business, understanding how people are, who's coming in the door, and how they are progressing, allows you to take action. So, for example, we know that our store managers, that my colleagues who run our 2,500 stores across the country, are really well represented into the socio-economic class. As soon as you move to the what we call area manager who runs 15 stores, it's all why is that? What do we need to do about it? What can help her? So understanding the data allows you to take action. It allows you to set up mentoring. It allows you to the qualitative data that you've got from making a lead. It's pretty difficult to read, because there's certain parts of but then you begin to understand that because you want them to get on. There's things we can do in terms of certainty of hours, in terms of mentoring schemes, in terms of financial systems. There's a range of things. I think for me and for a business, if you think social mobility is important, and if as a business you don't, you're not going to last long. But if you think it's important, you've got to get the data. The data gives you the insight to be able to take action, which means that your business can flourish and prosper because you maximize the talent you've got and you're attracting the right talent into the organisation.
Thank you, for that. So what's fascinating about that example you just shared is that that data from the managers, the area manager, showed you what was happening, but it doesn't necessarily show you why it's happening. How can you use data to get to the why as well as the what?
So I think the data, particularly if you begin to link up data with salary, with time of service, or you begin to get a richer picture. But honestly, that quantitative data allows you to ask the right kind of questions, and that's what we're making a leap into. The combination of quantitative data with a qualitative insight. The told us, for example, colleagues who are looking to move from team to store manager have got lack of certainty on their hours because they know they've got a core 18-hour contract, but they might get an extra 20 hours or 15 hours, but that's not certain, in which case they've got to get a second job. In that case, the opportunity to really go for the next promotion might be more difficult. But you get that from a qualitative work. And I think if you just do quantitative work, you don't have quality, which could be a set piece by making a link, or it could be written sessions that you do in your management line. That's when you start to be able to connect. Why are they not getting forward? It's to do with.
Brilliant, thank you. Resham, I need to come back to the question about the work you've been doing at the Social Mobility Commission specifically that you mentioned. So do tell us about that.
I will do. I just wanted to follow on that by saying actually an ODI report we did at the end of last year, it looked at cost of living crisis overall, but it looked at some of the issues with data definitions, which I think is a really interesting point to follow up on, especially talking about poverty or challenges, because actually we looked at, one of the things we looked at was fuel poverty, and fuel poverty right now defines households that live in houses with a certain EPC rating. And so if your house has a high enough EPC rating, so if it's considered well insulated enough, you're not caught in these definitions of living in fuel poverty, but actually we think that's about 3.5 million people living in fuel poverty that are just not registered at all. So if you were looking at the question, why are people not progressing? We can collect all the data we want on what their parents did, what their education levels are, but actually if they're living in a house that they cannot afford to turn the heating on because of the insulation issues, or they're living in food poverty, and households most likely to live in those types of food and fuel poverty are ones where the oldest member of the household is 25 or under. So we're talking about young people being very seriously impacted at a pivotal time in their life. You actually end up in a situation where they can't progress in their work or in employment because they're cold and hungry, and that leads to health issues too. So actually overlaying that data alongside some of the other data, not necessarily having a financial safety net, is really invaluable and important. But on the State of the Nation report, like I said, some brilliant people here involved in that work. But the State of the Nation for last year. So it's a statutory obligation of the Social Mobility Commission to release a State of the Nation report. We lay it before Parliament. But for the first time ever, we were able to break this down using data to look at region and protected characteristics. So we looked at occupation, income, education, housing, and wealth, and we were able to break this down by age group. But having it broken down into 5 socio-economic backgrounds instead of the 3 meant we were able to create gaps, as you were talking about, you know, to really be able to break down the impact of the least advantaged and the group above that, where there's often quite a big gap. And so we found some really challenging statistics from that. So if you're an adult whose parents were from a lower working class occupation, you're 3 times more likely to be in a lower working class occupation yourself compared to somebody whose parents were from a professional background. So these impacts are really long lasting, and we need to tackle that in a way that actually means that your chances to succeed in life and achieve your potential are not solely determined by where you grew up and what your parents did. And so now that we've got that data, we can actually start to recommend policies that tackle that. So we have a parenting campaign, for example, that tackles the first 3 years of life, because if you leave it later than that, you've lost a really vital and invaluable part where you need that child to be able to be at a certain level, so when they start school they can pick up on that. So that's really important. And then the final thing on that I hope people will play around with, if you're into data, and I assume you all are, otherwise you know, how would you be here?
Yeah. Anyone who doesn't like data, do feel
maybe one person panel, I thought of it. But we actually have a data explorer tool, which is a kind of more of a visual tool, so it's really fun to play around with. You can break it down into regions, so it's at ITL 2 level, so the UK is broken down into 41 regions. And really it's interactive maps and charts and commentary that take the data sets we use for the Social Mobility Commission's State of the Nation report and it overlays it. So our hope is that people in local government, national government, policymakers, think tanks, organisations like yours will be able to play around with it and see the real issue of social mobility within your region. And I hope in coming years we can break it down even further. But it's a really brilliant tool, and like I said, I get to brag about it because I didn't do it myself. So
we'll make sure we share that with all the participants after the event. That sounds like a really brilliant asset to have a go at. Lewis, in your work at ETI, what key data sets do you use, and what do you see as the gaps we need to address to improve our understanding of social mobility?
Cool. I mean, so I think I alluded to a few of these here and there, but so we have the kind of the big administrative data set that we look at. So that's the National People Data Set, that's the record of all the pupils in state-funded schools. And now we have that exciting link I was mentioning with the kind of the DWP and HMRC data that allows us to actually track pupils from that data. That gives kind of a glimpse. And then I guess the other thing we use, which was mentioned right at the beginning, is kind of more cohort longitudinal studies, which allow us to actually really track people with a lot more detail, a lot more questions are asked, and we can know a bit more about family circumstance, things like the learning cohort study. But kind of the challenge there is once they're really detailed, the sample size is way less. So the learning cohort study thinks about 7,000 people. So as soon as you start trying to break things down, as it sounds like you've done with your tool, which I imagine I should do, is when you start getting down to geographical, trying to look at intersectionality with other things, ethnicity or gender or what have you, the cell sizes get so small. And so I think really the key is to kind of use those to supplement some of the administrative stuff, but the real push and the gap, I think, is on those administrative data sets, can we get those links for this people parent map data set that DfE has internally, would be really exciting for us to get our hands on, and then we can actually start looking at parents' incomes and their kind of stuff going on, and that's linked with their kind of pupil outcomes. We can really start, and then eventually link that to Leo, the individual pupil's future kind of life outcomes, and you've got quite a full picture across that kind of intergenerational situation. So I think that's a big thing, and then I think a few of those other things I mentioned, obviously that solves the FSM problem that I was talking about, where we just got this like one group. Now we have a whole continuum potentially, and then there's just those missing pupils. I think that's the big thing, is that the private school things at the top, and the other thing which I didn't mention earlier is there's a whole kind of bunch of pupils, and it's increasingly a problem post pandemic, where they disappear from the system and we don't know they've gone.
Mm.
And that's a big worry because we think that maybe a lot of those people are not particularly high socioeconomic background, and if we can't track them, even in these big administrative data sets, that's a pretty big issue. Where are they? More fundamentally, tomorrow, where are they? Are they safe if they're not in school? But for the future, if we can't track them and see where they are, that might be a problem. Or some of them might be very happy in homeschool, but there's a bit of a data out there.
So there's both gaps and where we link up the data as well, the both challenges.
Both are big challenges, and I think that the data linkage, I think it's very easy for us to say, oh, it's really simple, you just take them over here and take them over here and you just join them together. And I think I appreciate that is not quite that simple. But then there is probably a kind of a wider argument or debate that needs to be had. I know the Children's Commission has already pushed for this, but can we have kind of identifiers that link people throughout their lives so that make them joining a lot of these data sets? So at the moment, what happens is you have these separate data sets, and we might know some information about kind of some postcode information and maybe a few characteristic things, and people are trying to fuzzy match based on these different characteristics these data sets develop. And if we've actually had unique identifiers for every person, I appreciate there's lots of kind of potential privacy concerns around all that kind of stuff, but that's a bit of a barrier for actually doing this stuff and doing it on a continual basis. Because what ends up happening is if people go away, create a people data set, but then next year to do the same thing is really hard. So having many years of data becomes really quite hard.
So single identifiers, but also common standards in what type of data you're collecting. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the Children's Commission. I've spoken to her recently about data for public services. So her argument for joining up data for young people is actually to kind of drive public service interventions rather than kind of measure and track social mobility. But essentially that kind of joined up architecture for data could be used for both purposes.
I think definitely if someone owning something at the central government, because as was alluded to earlier, you've got all of these data sets as well, are held by different people that different data owners. Some kind of solves a lot of problems.
Is it worth just touching on those privacy questions for a moment? Like, how do you make sure that they are put to good effect, that they aren't used in ways that kind of bake in existing bias in society? Do you have thoughts on that, Lewis? And then I'm sure.
It's obviously a tricky and tough subject for some people, but I think obviously we already have access to lots of these data sets individually, and it's not that they're completely available to anybody. They're kind of open, but you can't just like go on the internet and find someone's kind of GCSE results or anything like that. So it's all held in very kind of secure data set environments. You have to have certifications and trainings to be able to use the data and what have you, but it means that researchers can actually go in and have those things. I think the joining per se doesn't pose many more additional issues. Everybody's going to be de-identified. It's not that you can identify an individual. I have to find myself in the data. And if we're already allowing researchers to look at this data, why not let them hit it? Yeah, I think would be my argument.
Yeah. Resham, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really great. And actually, if anyone is really interested in data protection in terms of the legislative agenda, the data protection bill is going through the laws at the moment. And one of the elements of it that we're very concerned about, along with other groups of society, is the removal of data protection impact assessments and the removal of the need for data protection officers in organisations. Our view is the cost saving is minimal, it's sub £100 a year to businesses, but actually, if we want to create a system where open data is kind of the default, where it's safe to do so, and where data is trusted to be shared and used in your best interest, then actually we need to do everything we can as a country to build up the data trust that people have, to strengthen the ecosystem and to make sure it feels trustworthy. So that's one thing we're working very hard to try and challenge. But when it comes to people understanding or trusting in data, what you actually need is higher levels of data literacy. And it's funny when you talk to policymakers about that, they're like, yes, we should have data literacy in the school curriculum. And we're like, yes, we absolutely should. But actually, we need our policymakers to have higher levels of data literacy so they can understand. And, you know, obviously we've got some very kind of highly literate people, but we also have policymakers that don't fully understand the implications or the risks. So data literacy is hugely important. The building the trust is really important. And you mentioned the biases. Actually, one of the key issues tackling that is diversity. So making sure we've got diversity of every kind in the room to understand the challenges. So we've seen, for example, the use of data in parts of the US, for example, in the parole decisions, where Black men were 3 times more likely to be denied parole than white men because the data was so biased. We've seen recruitment platforms where women and ethnic minorities are rejected at a far higher rate than white men because the system has learned from the CVs that's taken in that a successful senior executive is a white male in their 40s or 50s. So we have to really have data interrogation at every stage of the process to make sure that we're not embedding and amplifying these biases, because the data can be really powerful for good and for bad. And as you say, if the biases are there, it leads to a reduction in trust. So we think the data is really powerful, but that's why we want the data sets opened up, because civil society researchers, organisations like yours and mine are much more likely to be able to assess and spot these negative potential issues than policymakers who think this is the way to go. And we've seen from the budget already the intention to utilise data set and AI technology much more in the NHS and justice and policing. And that could really help us with efficiencies, but it could harm marginalised groups and those from less advantaged groups more than others. And that's something we need to be very cognizant of and tackle those challenges and barriers at the start and the whole way through.
Absolutely, absolutely. And remember that there's bias in the real world as well. And if you're designing systems to change it, like with social mobility, you can use the data to correct for that as well. Yeah. Paul, I wanted to kind of focus more on the employer's kind of role again in this. At Demos, we've spent the last 8 months with a team from across Demos redesigning our diversity, equity and justice and inclusion programme. And we've held off kind of doing the data deep dive because we wanted to kind of set out our strategy and kind of what we wanted to achieve so that we could then design the data infrastructure around that. It's really complex kind of, you know, it feels a bit chicken and egg, like what don't we know before kind of really setting out the kind of strategy for using data in what we do. How can employers use data they've collected on their workforce to drive change in their organisation?
So if you look back at what we've done over the last 18 months, it's the insight that we got more close to positively that has allowed us to define a 9-point plan, social mobility. And there's a set, and what that, there's a few outcomes from that. So one is about external leadership. So things like a class data report allows you to publish that. Why is that important? Because transparency really drives better outcomes. That's interesting. The work that we're doing on socio-economic balance protected characteristics, I think is also important. So there's a set of things you can do externally. But I think internally then, what that data allows you to do is to put in place real measures, as I said before, that allow you to support people to fulfill their potential. We also, by the way, just on that data point, aside from running 2,500 shops, etc., we also run 35 schools. We run 35 schools, all in challenging areas. The data and insight we get from those children in our Kotecha Academy and their experience of coming into work is really interesting, because it begins to shape how we then recruit. How can we recruit in a way that looks at people's potential, not at what practice got aspects of that value? And I think that connection for us and that transition from employment to work, because we have it within an organisation, is really powerful. I think it comes down to me. If you believe as a business diversity will give you a better performance, then why would you not begin to look at the data and understand what it's telling you? If you don't believe that, fine, don't. Okay. So the co-op, there's an additional thing there, which is that we're a member owned all these co-op in the world. Our members, like 5.4 million, told us we want you to do more on social mobility. We want you to take action as a business and provide leadership in the sector. So for us, there's both the business outcome there, but there's also our owners holding.
We're starting to kind of really paint a picture of how data from an employer level to a systems level can really drive improvement in social mobility and challenge some of the discrimination and bias kind of that exists in the real world, kind of really progress things as well. And it's quite a compelling image, but I want to come back to the question of kind of how can we make it true? How can we achieve this in kind of policy terms as employers and in political leadership? How should we be thinking about this? But before we kind of arrive back at the kind of how we do it, I just wanted to open up for a round of questions from the floor. I'm sure everyone's brains has been whirring away. I'll take the first 3 hands that have gone up, starting at the back, please. I'll take them.
Sorry, I'm a principal economist from the Futures Foundation, so really have to hear everything you were saying about young people.
Sorry, what was your name?
Andrea.
Thank you.
So we are doing a lot of work on risk of need, so people not in education find their training. We're a grant making organization and we do a lot of research very hyper locally, so we work directly with councils. And we put together a system so you can actually identify young people in schools who are likely to be, say, 5-6 years from now, using data from their parents and from themselves from they were like 10 and 12. But the issue some of the local authorities and councils have is that they have no capacity or money to put together all of their statutory data together so that schools can actually in person. And I think it's a really interesting question around with devolving powers to local areas, with local areas having a lot of data themselves. Is there then a problem with the fact that they have no capacity, money, or even knowledge to use the data in a way that can be helpful? Our risk of need measure was largely, it could be predicted on socio-economic factors as to why these young people are going to be moved in the future. So I think that is just a question I had, whether or not the central government should be doing something about funding some of the local areas so they can actually use their own data to answer really important.
Fantastic question. I'll probably give
I
it
work for the Department of Education. I see having more data from an employer perspective is really powerful. I do wonder at the kind of public policy level, having more data, more insights, more granular level stuff, is it really going to impact like what we do and what we know about how we can improve the outcomes for children from like lower socioeconomic backgrounds? Because in that respect, we do actually know a lot of the difficulties and the solutions that like how do we get more funding for them, how do we help them to improve their educational attainment and those types of challenges which knowing more is not necessarily going to help.
I actually think your questions are quite similar, aren't they? Kind of like you learn something, but actually is the system set up to kind of drive and respond to that or funded to respond to that? And I'll probably go in front here.
I'm Becky Borrow from the Social Mobility Foundation. It's actually a nice coincidence to have this discussion today, because today is the day that our Social Mobility Employer Index opens for entries. So it'll be open for the next 3 months, and Co-op know it well and have been big supporters, so that's
You
good.
will share that as well.
Thank you so much. It's an annual benchmarking and assessment tool for employers to get advice and feedback on how to improve social mobility in their organisations. But it's currently the last round was 143 employers entered. We obviously want to drive that up, but it's not going to be cover all employers. So I was just wondering what kind of policy interventions does the panel think could incentivise employers to address social mobility and to improve socioeconomic diversity in their organisations on a much more kind of wider scale?
Brilliant question. So Andrea, on what do you do when you find something out and but don't have the cash to kind of invest in it? Mohammed, a similar question on how do we know what to do? And Becky, on what are the policy interventions to improve this situation? Volunteers.
I'll start. There's some research from Morley Common about a year ago that said over the last 10 years, most people think that we've got better at ensuring equality for gender and ethnicity and got worse about equality in relation to socioeconomic balance. So I think there's 2 things here. The choices that are being made a political choices, right? Priority. If we want to change the political choice being made, data is really important, actually, and more data is really important. Because there is something, I'm a public affairs professional, I've been in government for 20 years, I've been in this job for 8 years. If you want to change the minds of politicians, you do that through data, right? You keep particularly qualitative data. So that data piece is so important. If you want to change the political decision making that says we're not going to fund children's services in the local communities, just look at what Birmingham did over the last few days. So I think the data actually is really important. I understand the point. I wasn't policymaker 20 years. I don't actually think there's a thing of too much to do because you can use data to persuade. In relation to businesses, and it's a really interesting question. In truth, and you will know it far better than me, businesses that want to do this are doing it. You don't have to worry about them. Businesses that don't care. Now, at some point, the race for talent will mean that businesses do start to care. My own view is government can make an intervention here that shapes social economic background as something that businesses have to take into account. We make a change. Yeah, and now that's a big thing. I don't think this government are interested. I'm not sure if a new government or whatever, but it will be what it might be. But if you want to make it really important, I think you have to put an explicit expectation on businesses. Now that's tricky. If I look at something we did on slavery and second slavery, to put an expectation on it, you've got to make sure you deliver it and do it in the right way. For me, if you want businesses to really think about this and there's an economic productivity benefit at the end of it, you've got to make it an expectation. Some kind of explicit legislative date would be my view.
I guess I have less to say on employers' indexes, but on the other 2 points, I think yes, central government definitely has a role in shaping things, and I think we do want to allow local areas. They all have their own challenges, and social mobility will look very different in different areas. But there's definitely a role, as I was saying, that central government, probably in the centre of the central government, has a role to bring the data together from departments. There's also a role for governments in setting some clear ideas about what are the important things to be measuring, and potentially even doing some of that measuring themselves and sharing that more with kind of local areas to help. I think knowing more to the second question, is knowing more helpful? I think knowing more is always going to be helpful. The risk is, are there diminishing returns to knowing more effectively? I think when we come to think about social mobility at the moment, as I've said, I think there's some clear gaps that we have. And so in this case, I think knowing more definitely has some value. I think if we can really understand what the drivers are, then we can really get to having some good solutions. And once we then start, the other side of it is, once we start thinking of policy solutions and policy responses, can we then evaluate them, measure them? Do they work? Because that's the other thing. It's all very well saying we've got all the data that we think we need, and this is the policy response, but then we need to monitor that. We need to know, we need the data from that to know, is it working? And I guess, as I alluded to right at the beginning, one of the hardest things with social mobility is getting to the final outcome takes a very long time. So it's quite hard to evaluate things. Like government puts in a program today, we're not going to know if that works for a very long time. We have the intermediate outcomes, the education outcomes, other things, but really to know whether things can really work takes very long. And therefore that backwards look or current look isn't really important.
Thank you. Great, thank you. So 3 really fascinating questions. Becky, one of the things I love every International Women's Day is there's if you haven't seen it, go look for it, but there's a Twitter bot that every time a company posts something about happy International Women's Day or whatever, it replies with, your gender pay gap is this. And I think it's so fantastic because you get these companies who get called out on like, well, it's great that you tweeted happy, International Women's Day, but your pay gap is awful. And so I think, actually, sometimes a carrot and stick approach really works. And actually, if companies are not incentivized either through government requirement or through actually doing good or because the diversity, benefits them, then actually let's name and shame, because you know, this is really important, and talent is everywhere, opportunity is not. We should be working to change that. It shouldn't matter where you're born or what your parents do. So I'm very pro, I don't know how to do it, but if someone does know how to do an equivalent Twitter bot, I think that would be great. Mohammed, public policy, will it really impact? I'm a strong believer that it will, but it depends. Your point about diminishing returns is really important. I think the question comes down to what do we need to collect and why? So, for example, the work we do at the SMC, we know that there are people whose parents are recorded as having kind of less senior jobs or positions. But often, if you're from an immigrant family, you might be very well educated in your home country, but it could be language barriers, it could be lack of a professional network, it could be a confidence issue, it could be undermatching by virtue of where you live, because that's where your community is. That means that actually you might be reported as having a lower income or a lower kind of occupation status, but actually your children have the benefit of well-educated parents who have the time and energy to support them. And so actually, if we can understand that and differentiate between people whose parents are stable and educated, but might not have, you know, kind of the jobs that report to them being in a more advantaged group, those children tend to do very well. So actually helping us understand the cultural issues, and that's where the diversity comes into it, but understanding the different life situations people are in, I think will shape public policy if the politicians want it to. And there has to be a will. It's about, you know, do you want this to be a priority or not? So I think we can do everything we can on the data. It's where we at the FMC and a whole bunch of other organisations come in terms of creating the political incentive to do so. And that's why I think individuals play such an important part, because we can all advocate to our political representatives that this is something we care about. And Andrea, I think that's a really great point about the funding issue. There are a lot of issues around current funding that would save funding in the longer term, but you need the upfront investment. So actually, if we could tackle needs before they get into neatness, I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but it works for my sentence structure. If we could do that, we'd actually save a huge amount, not only on kind of their life chances, but on, you know, benefits and support systems. Their children would be better off. So it's about kind of, could we create funds in the short term that would save longer term funds? We actually at the SMC had the privilege of interviewing Ed Balls for a podcast that's coming out in a couple of weeks. It's about his regional inequalities papers that he's co-authored. They've interviewed hundreds of people, including some former prime ministers. And one of the things that he came out with as a recommendation, or that the paper came out with as a recommendation, was about a cross-party consensus or commission towards tackling his view was regional inequalities, but I think that should spread towards social mobility. And the more we turn issues into something that is kind of, I think this, your way's wrong, you think that, you know, that kind of thing, as soon as we politicize it, it means we're going to get policies that are short term. So you will do things that tie in with the length of an electoral term. And as we've discussed, these things take time. So if every 5 years you're chopping and changing to create new policies, because you want to be seen as being different to your predecessors, we're going to end up with incohesive, incoherent, and less impactful policies. So it's about how can we bring together a view on social mobility that is more cohesive and longer term, so that we can have a policy structure for 20 years that means actually future generations will have the best chances of succeeding regardless of where they're born and what their parents do.
If people will forgive me, Chair Privilege, I'm going to channel a couple of colleagues to riff on that point, because we have a colleague who's working on needs and youth employment with Youth Futures Foundation. And that point about kind of prevention funding, how do you put money into the system to save money later? Actually, the answer to that is that the Treasury doesn't believe that will work, because it can't track the data of where the savings are felt and how there's a data kind of answer to that as well. And channeling another colleague who's working on kind of Treasury funding for prevention, we've designed a third stream of funding within the Treasury to ring fence funding for prevention for exactly that purpose, so that you can measure it over longer terms and you can show the savings across government as well. So I just wanted to, I knew my colleagues, if they were in the room, would be chomping at the bit to kind of follow up with the question. I wanted to kind of share that. But it's also quite an interesting moment around this as well, because politically you've got Labour setting out a mission, Labour most probably forming the next government, setting out a mission that focuses on social mobility and talking about prevention as well. So the more kind of policy solutions we can provide in that space, kind of the greater the progress will be. I just want to come back. Are there any more questions in the room? Yes, let me go back. Anyone else? So okay, 1, 2, 3, and that will be our last round.
Thanks, Megan Stagman from the General Council. I was just going to ask, I think both Resham and Louis have spoken about the difficulty of forecasting, that you look backwards on the data, both in terms of, I guess, understanding life paths and generational changes, but also what the impact of policy is. And so to use everyone's favourite buzzword at the moment, I wondered if you saw a role for AI in this. You know, how much can we model and anticipate what things might look like rather than just having to look backwards?
Brilliant question.
Hi, I'm Alec from the Intergenerational Foundation, and Lewis, you mentioned that wealth is becoming increasingly important when you look at social mobility, particularly in education. And I wanted to ask if you think that there is currently a gap in how much wealth data there is, because traditionally social mobility has very much looked at income, and whether that is something that needs to change, or is there something being done right now that you think is important, or any other thoughts on this wealth versus income when thinking of social mobility?
Brilliant, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacob from Whitestone Insights, and my question was, what are the biggest barriers to harmonizing data and making it accessible at the moment? And are there other countries who've done a better job at that?
Fantastic, succinct question. Thank you very much. I'm going to just go down the panel again, pick up the parts you want to talk to.
Yeah, I'm probably further off. I think probably colleagues will have more to say on goals than me.
Fair enough.
The
Hang
one
on,
point,
barriers.
the one point I would say, I think, is the point about wealth is a really interesting one. Because if I think about what we see from many children coming through our schools and on personal experience, it's not just income, it's the social capital and the communal network that people have. And in a sense, is that a proxy for wealth? It may or may not be, but it's a really interesting question. I think wealth will be a critical question.
That social capital is so interesting. Some of our work around redesigning work services has looked at how you build the social capital between users of the services as well as receiving services to exactly that point. Liz, do you want to talk about wealth and barriers joining up those things?
Yeah. So I think you're right. I think wealth is the big thing we probably don't talk enough about. We talk a lot about income, we talk a lot about information. The biggest reason I honestly think is just we can measure those things a lot easier. And lots of the data linkage that's happened has been with data sets that are not necessarily collected for the purpose of looking at those things. So even like the data I was talking about, HMRC collects data on incomes because it wants to tax you. And we can link those back, and that's great, but it's not being collected for the actual reason of looking at social mobility. I think I can't even think on the top of my head a good source of like administrative data on wealth of households. Maybe you can, but I think it's going to be key, and it becomes increasingly more. It's become increasingly more important over time. As well, as I said earlier, I think housing is a big element of that. It's not the only element of that. That we probably have more data on, because we know there are some data sets that are linking people to where they live, and we can know something about the relative cost of those places they live, and whether their parents are renting, for example, or owning their own home. And I think that's a really interesting space for this kind of conversation to essentially kind of reach into. Harmonizing data, I think, I guess, coming back to what I said before, I think the biggest problem is both not having kind of central direction to kind of join things up, and I also think that actually doing the joining is quite hard. I think being able to have some way where we can much more easily harmonize data, but I think back to the privacy concerns, that becomes really hard. And so we're probably stuck with doing a bit of a fuzzy job of that. there are definitely, I'm trying to, they come to my mind and I've lost it. There is somewhere in Europe, I think it's Scandinavia, in Estonia, yeah, where they do that basically. They have an identifier. You can join it together. It's very, very easy to do that kind of harmonization. I'll speak to AI very quickly, but I'm sure you probably know more about AI. I think AI presents both an interesting angle on some of that predictive stuff. It also makes things incredibly hard because it's I think we're seeing a really big accelerated shift in the labour market in what AI means that things are going to be doing in the future. So whilst it may allow us to do better predictions into the future, AI models are still being fed by data from the past. And so you never really get around that problem. I think in a way it causes even more problems because the future probably looks a lot more different than it did previously.
Really interesting. On the kind of joining up data and privacy concerns, I've been really interested in some of the studies that show that people already think this happened. It's like that it's kind of assumed now that our data is joined up, and they probably assume we do it better than we do it.
Well, I think the biggest problem there is people get their information, as it were, from all of the privacy stuff that's going around in like social media and internet. And so people are very worried about that. And I think the data that government collects looks very different to the data social media companies are collecting.
Just a sad fact that people trust Facebook.
Yeah, so in addition to Estonia, Singapore also does it very well. So Jacob, thanks for that question. In terms of harmonization of data, I did a political trip to Estonia, feels like a long time ago now, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. So they've obviously evolved significantly in their data use. But I thought one of the most fascinating things they said to us is we're able to do everything we can do with data. They also have national ID cards, which they said enable that, which is a whole other challenge that we might have to think about. But they said the reason they can do it is because people implicitly trust that their data is safe. And so they had I want to say a former president who went into hospital, 3 medical staff checked his records, who didn't have a need to check his records. They didn't do anything with it. They didn't tell it to the papers or anything. They just thought, have a nosy on my lunch break. One was suspended and one was struck off. And so they said, if that's the situation where you feel your personal and private and health data is treated with that level of security, you'll trust the sharing of that data. Do you think that would happen in the UK? And we were kind of like, well, I mean, I don't even know that people would know there's been a data breach, forget the trust. So I think that's a really important issue. And so that's part of the kind of perception issue we've got to tackle. So we've got as much of a PR and comms challenge around data use as we do around the actual infrastructure and use of it. But I would look at Singapore and Estonia, they're very good. In terms of the wealth gap, Alec, I think the points that have been made are absolutely brilliant. I think the social capital point is so true. We see so much undermatching of people who come from less privileged backgrounds, under-selecting because of a confidence issue, because of a network issue. If you know people who are strategy consultants and you want to apply for a consulting job, you know how to prep for the interview. So now we're starting to see consultancies releasing practice case studies along with examples of how to answer them, because you shouldn't have to know someone to tell you how to do a case study or how to get into university. So I do think that's really important. And actually, sorry, I did mean to say one of the things that the UK is a leader in, that we are doing fantastically well when it comes to data, is smart data schemes. So if you aren't kind of a huge fan of open banking already, please look into it. One of my roles, I sit on the Smart Data Council for the government, and we're looking at which sectors we can open this up to next. So there's a commitment in the budget. But open banking was started as an initiative to help people switch bank accounts more easily. And actually, that was the use case. It's not what it's actually been used for. But there's this huge proliferation of innovation and all these amazing apps. So we've actually democratized access to services that previously only wealthy people could access. So you can now have savings advice, investment advice, financial advice. You can now have apps that will help you work out how to save a bit more, or apps that will tell you what you're spending your money on, or how to get to your goals. And so by opening up some of these smart data schemes, we'll be able to see more equality when it comes to what you can do as an individual that doesn't require simple payment for services, which I think is really exciting. And then Megan, your question on forecasting. Our forecasts are only as good as the data that feeds them. So one, we have a challenge that a lot of our data, like I said, we've only got 4 longitudinal studies since World War II, do we think that people born in the 50s and 60s, that the data from their lives are going to be similar or valuable in helping us predict the lives of our children or grandchildren? It's a very challenging question to actually work out how to take that data and apply it to future. So we will definitely see the incorporation of AI in forecasting, but I'd be very concerned about trusting it without testing it very thoroughly as to how we incorporate current life into that. Where I do think AI is really exciting is around the opportunity to tackle inequalities that exist now. So generative AI in education, if we can ensure that people have access to the technology through making sure children or young people have the Wi-Fi they need or have the devices they need, actually that could be like every single student having a personal tutor or having that teaching assistant. It would mean that we could tackle health inequalities because AI is really good at detecting health outcomes. That could mean we could save money and make efficiencies in the NHS, for example. But one challenge we do have to think about is structural unemployment that will arise from AI. So we still see, when we look at regions, the impact of structural unemployment in the 70s and 80s that came around from closing manufacturing and coal mines. That is still causing an impact on young people today and will continue to do so because we haven't taken the steps to tackle that structural, the scars from that structural unemployment. AI is coming, it's already here, but it's going to increase in terms of its impact in the workforce, and we need to make sure we're ready to tackle what that means for the least well-off and the least advantaged and least educated in society, because we don't want that to be a repetition of the 70s and 80s, where their children and grandchildren will suffer for decades to come because of changes in the workplace that we can't fully predict right now.
We've got 3 more minutes and I do have a final question for you, but I just want to check, have we got any questions online that haven't been covered already in the room?
Yeah, it's funny. And there was a question around data linkages, which I thought has really been well covered. There is one around, we've spoken a lot about kind of regional and area-based sort of data. One thing that comes out of people in places, your State of the Nation report, is around devolved administrations and kind of lack of consistency there. And I was just wondering, you know, why does that matter? What are the opportunities there, and what would kind of needs to be done? Yeah, I mean, that would be a sort of a general question. I guess I was addressing Resham just because it's your report.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, we've talked a lot about data consistency and inconsistency. We also need to talk about policy consistency and inconsistency, because if we have people whose issues are being tackled in different ways in different regions, we'll have inevitably different outcomes. And from a social science point of view, that's really exciting. You get to see what works and what doesn't. So I personally am not, I don't think the funding free school meals for all primary school children is a good use of money. But as a social scientist, I'm really fascinated to see what impact that will have on children's outcomes. So it's one of those, what will work and what won't work. Where does it come from and who for? And are we really being consistent? Are we creating a poster, or are we being consistent in terms of the outcomes we're creating for people? And we see different devolved authorities with different budgets, different abilities to impact the policies that are enacted, and different, you know, just by political allegiance, different abilities to get an audience with central government when it comes to pushing for what their areas need. And tied to that comes in incentives for businesses and employers to move to regions where we really need strong employment to stop the brain drain of people having to move to the southeast.
Fantastic. By way of summing up, I'm going to sum up very briefly what we've heard, but I'm going to ask for a final kind of response from each of our brilliant panelists. So we started off hearing what gets measured gets done, and that feels kind of like the key message that comes away from this. At a moment where Labour is promising these missions, and the particular one about social mobility, in policy terms, what would each of you suggest an incoming government does to put data at the heart of that mission, or to really press employers to improve their data? I'll start with Paul.
I'll come back to what I said before. I think if the political choices are, you know, secure announced 5 missions up in Manchester, and I was headed towards the continent to hear it. I think if this is important to an incoming administration, people ever often say, people like more angry, then you've got to make that a reality. Just saying this, you know, the social mobility project shows that there's really great businesses doing it, and more businesses doing it. So I think you, in terms of policy intervention around data, make it a obligation, a legislative obligation to collect after this time. So, you know, the 101 reasons why you wouldn't want to do that, and you know, but if this is important, you know, you've got to put the money where it's not.
Thank you, Lewis.
I think one thing would be to set up some separate team, whether that sits in the cabinet office or somewhere else in the centre of part of government. That's entire focus is bringing data from across government together. I think that would be great in terms of some of the stuff we've been talking about. And the other thing it'd be great for is actually it'll be a cost saver. Because I think there's lots of different systems, lots of different places, and that's really expensive. So there's a cost efficiency.
Thank you, and Resham.
So in addition to those, we urge government to make sure the data is high quality, make sure it's interoperable, and then as much as possible, make sure it's open to everyone.
Fantastic. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for a really brilliant audience with loads of great questions and expertise in the room. I've really enjoyed all your questions. Thank you for joining us at Demos today. We'll follow up with those links afterwards. But thank you all, and I hope you survived the brain out there after this. Thank you for coming.